If you're wondering about the difference between the Canon R6 Mark II and the Canon R8 for wildlife photography, and you're wondering if you should shell out the extra $1,000 to the Canon R6 Mark II, or save an extra $1,000 by buying the Canon R8, well, let's talk about it. Canon released the R8 on the heels of the Canon R6 Mark II. They both share the same sensor and processor in the camera. And if you've watched any videos about the Canon R6 Mark II, you'll know that the readout speed of this camera is better than even the Canon R5. The only camera that comes close to this as far as readout speed in the Canon line is their pseudo flagship, the Canon R3. We also know that the image quality in both these cameras is excellent. We've seen what it looks like in the R6 Mark II, and the image quality in the R8 is exactly the same. Both cameras share the top button layout along with the hot shoe. They also share the same ports on the side, the HDMI, the mics, the headphone, and the USB and HDMI, exactly the same. They both support the same internal, fully functioning autofocus in both cameras, which is the trickle down from Canon R3, which is amazing. This, to me, is the best autofocus that's sitting on the market right now. I've tested Nikon, Canon, and Sony. The only camera I haven't tested is the Canon A1 in those three camera brands, but this one so far has been the stickiest and the best autofocus that I've found so far. They also share the same exact LCD screen on the back, same resolution, same functions, such touch, everything exactly the same. So what's the issue in? Then just buy the Canon R8. Well, for a $1,000 difference, there has to be some trade-offs between these two cameras, and yes, there is. So what are those differences? And as wildlife photographers, do those differences really matter for us? So let's look at them. The biggest differences in the two bodies you're going to notice right off the bat is the body size. The Canon R6 Mark II shares the same body as the Canon R6. The Canon R8 shares the body of the Canon RP. The weight of the Canon R6 Mark II is 1.5 pounds, and the weight of the Canon R8 is 1 pound. A pretty sizable difference in the two. In the hand, you can really tell the difference in the weight of these two cameras when you pick them up. The R6 Mark II also has better weather sealing than the Canon R8, but I would suggest that anytime you have inclemental weather on both cameras is to have a rain cover on these cameras. Don't pull a Scott and do what I do. Now, I will tell you that I had this camera out in wet snow for a good part of a day, and I didn't have any issues with this camera. Again, don't do that, but I did. The real difference you're going to see on these two cameras is going to be on the back of these two cameras. So what you're going to notice right off the bat when you look at it is the R6 Mark II has a joystick and the R8 does not have a joystick. To me, joysticks just get in my way, and a lot of times I disable them because what happens to me, I bump them and I move my single point where I don't want it. If you do need a joystick on the R8, since it's lacking here, there's two ways to control your autofocus points on this camera instead of having the joystick. One is you can assign a portion of the screen to be your joystick and control it with your thumb to move your focus points around. Or you can use the D-pad on the back to change where your focus points are. So the lack of a joystick is not an end-of-the-world thing because you have two ways in this camera to control your focal points if you need to change those. Two other differences you're going to notice that's different from the R6 Mark II and the R8 is you do not have the rate button or the magnification button on the R8. I don't use the rate button ever on any camera I've had. I do my rating in post, so to me that's not a detrimental thing. To you, it depends on how you do your workflow. And the magnification button, I really don't think about either because usually when I want to magnify, I'm hitting the review button on the back, the play button, and I'm pinching it anyway. So those two buttons missing really to me is not really even an issue for myself. The final biggest thing on the back of the camera that you're going to notice is the lack of a dial on the R6 Mark II as opposed to a D-pad on the R8. Having the dial is nice on the camera to control your exposure triangle. You can assign one button or one dial to your shutter, one to your ISO, and one to your aperture. On this one you can do the same thing, but instead of having a dial you can assign your aperture changes to this D-ring down here if you want to, the D-pad, excuse me. So yes, having the dial here is nice, but you have the exact same functionality, and you actually have a little more functionality because you can assign a lot more to this D-pad than you can with the ring on the back of the camera. So it's a trade-off either way. It depends on how you work and what you want to assign on the back of the camera, which you like better. I find them both equally as good. You just have to think of them in a different manner, how you want to use the dial or the D-pad. The other distinctions on the two cameras is going to be the SD card door. So on the R6 Mark II, the card door is on the side of the camera. On the R8, the door is shared by the SD card and the battery. The differences in these two, again, are big because the R6 Mark II can use 2 SD cards and the R8 you can only use 1 SD card. For me, that's not a large issue for only having 1 card because I don't shoot redundant. I know, I should be shooting redundant and I'm silly for not shooting redundant because what if 1 card fails? I've never had a card fail, but now I'll probably go out the next day and my card's going to fail. But if it does fail, I have another card in my pocket. But the biggest reason I don't have 2 V90 cards, and that's what you need to be shooting on these cameras is V90 because you want to take advantage of the 40 and 20 frames a second. It's not really the buffer, it's about how fast it clears the buffer after the buffer fills up. The faster card at V30 is about 72 and the V90 is at 300. You're going to clear that buffer almost 3 times as fast. So that's why you shoot a V90 card to get back in the game to shoot again if you hit that buffer. And the V90 cards are very expensive. They're about $200 for a 120 gig card and they go up from there. So my suggestion between these 2 cameras, if you're using a V90 SD card, is to buy the largest card you can for this camera and try to shoot a larger card or have another card on hand. It just takes a second to swap the card out. You know pretty quick when you're getting close to the end of that card, getting it full. So to me, the 2 versus 1 is not that large an issue for myself. Because I just don't shoot redundant. I know, I should, but I don't. Since we're already in the battery compartment of these 2 cameras, let's look at the batteries because that's another huge difference in these 2 cameras. So the difference in that is the R8 takes an LPE17 battery, which is a 1040 milliamp hour battery. The Canon R8 takes the LPE6NH batteries, which are at 2130 milliamp hours. So almost double of this little guy. What that means is you're going to have to carry a few more of these LPE17H batteries in your bag as opposed to you're going to have to carry for the R6 Mark II. The difference in the price on these is about $20 most of the time that I see, so it's really not even that much of a saving for the smaller battery. But with this RP size body, that's the only battery that's going to fit in there that Canon currently makes, unless they came with a whole new battery, which would have meant this camera would have cost more money. So next, let's talk about the internals of these 2 cameras, and we'll start with the shutter. Both cameras share the full electronic shutter of 40 frames, 20 frames, and 5 frames a second. That's amazing at 40 frames a second. What the difference of these 2 is that the R8 does not have a full mechanical shutter. They both do have a first curtain electronic shutter though. And with this camera, for the frame rates in full mechanical or first curtain, it shoots 12 frames a second. The R8 will shoot 6 frames a second. But since we're wildlife photographers, we're going to be shooting at 40 and 20 frames a second almost all the time. The only times you would be in first curtain or mechanical on this one or first curtain this one is if you have an extreme whip pan, which I personally don't do very often. There are people who do whip pan shots on animals to get the blur of the animal in the background but get the head in focus, those type of things. If you did that, you want to be in the first curtain or in full mechanical on the R6 Mark II. Yes, that is twice the speed on this one in mechanical and first curtain, but again, I would think if you're shooting either one of these cameras for wildlife, you're shooting 40 and 20 frames a second. So again, not much of a difference there for me as far as that goes for the style of shooting that I do for wildlife photography. Also, with no full mechanical shutter on the R8, you have one issue also. And it's when the camera's off, since there's no full mechanical door, you don't have this door that comes down like on the R6 Mark II. You have this door, you can't touch the sensor, dust can't get into the sensor. On the R8, since there is no door for the mechanical shutter, when you open it up, you're going to see the sensor. I'm going to open that for a second because I don't want to get stuff in it. So when you change this lens, you have to remember to put it down, take this cap or the other lens off, change the lens out here. The reason is when you open this up, you don't want dust and debris falling into the camera and onto the sensor because then you'll have to clean the sensor more often. So with that being said, you're going to have to be more careful with this camera when you change lenses out, and you're probably going to have to clean the sensor more often to clean the R8, and be careful not to drop anything nasty inside of here. So next we're going to talk about buffer size at both these cameras at 40 frames a second and at 20 frames a second. I tested both these cameras the exact same way with the same lenses, the same subject, and the same lighting in a controlled indoor environment. That way we had the same amount of information hitting, saving to the cards during the buffer of each of these cameras. So at 40 frames a second on the R6 Mark II, you get about a 2-second burst, just shy of it. With the R8, you get a little over a second and a half, maybe a little less than a second and a half, but right around there. With the R6 Mark II at 40 frames a second, I was getting 66 shots before it hit the buffer. With the R8, I was consistently getting 52 shots, 14 shot difference between the two. I did this test over 20 times with each camera to get those numbers, and it consistently hit those numbers, 66 and 52. In 20 frames a second, the R6 Mark II was getting 77 shots before it hit the buffer. The R8 was getting 63. Again, 14 shot difference. Well over 20 times testing each one of these cameras, consistently getting those numbers. One thing to note on the R6 Mark II at 20 frames a second, if you hold the shutter down after it hits the 77, you continually hold it, it will do some stuttering, and then it'll finally stop. And consistently it hit 100 shots when it do this. So you can get 100 shots out of this, but not exactly at 20 frames a second. It's going to stutter there a little bit. With the R8, it did not stutter after it hit the buffer. Both cameras cleared their buffer pretty much in the same amount of time. So you're consistently getting 14 frame difference between the two in 40 or 20 regardless. One thing I will note about these two cameras when you're shooting 40 frames a second versus 20 frames a second. I'd probably be shooting 20 frames a second, and that's what I've been doing with these cameras lately instead of 40 frames a second. The reason that is 40 frames a second on most subjects is too fast. Unless you have a bird really moving fast or really wild wing moments, you don't want to shoot 40 frames a second. I had even swans flapping their wings. 40 frames a second with these cameras was too much. I had tons of shots where there was no movement in the wing until finally I'd see a little bit of movement. So there's a lot of extra wasted shots, and if a duck is or something just sitting still, you got even more wasted shots. So what I found myself doing most of the time was keeping this in 20 frames a second and changing it to 40 frames a second real quickly through a button on these cameras to jump to 40 when I had something happening really fast, and then going back to 20 frames a second for most of my other shots. So the difference in the buffer is there. 14 shots is not really significant, but it's enough to notice. Now, the trick you do with these two cameras when you're shooting 20 frames a second is to hold the shutter button down for less than 2 seconds, let off just briefly, and then back on it and hold it again. So you can do almost 2 seconds, almost 2 seconds, almost 2 seconds, and you'll never hit that buffer with both cameras. And that's usually the way I shoot. It's the way I'm used to shooting with the R7 and even the Nikon Z9. The fourth major difference in these two cameras is embodied image stabilization. R6 Mark II has it, the R8 does not have it. This is pretty controversial to a lot of folks. A lot of things think they need IBIS in the body. With wildlife photography, it'd be nice, but all of our lenses that we use as wildlife photographers have image stabilization in them, 2 to 4 to 5 stops sometimes, usually 2 to 3 stops what you have in the lens. You also have to remember that stop in a subject, stopping the subject, the wing, the eye, whatever, does not happen through image stabilization. It comes through shutter speed. So you remember the swan video a while back, I talked about chase your shutter, not your ISO. The same thing about image stabilization. There are many times where you actually are to turn your image stabilization off because it will actually mess with your image. It will cause motion blur with image stabilization on in certain scenarios. So not having IBIS in the body, to me, is not a deal breaker for these two cameras. Yes, be nice to have, but it's not something you have to have for wildlife photography. Rely on your shutter speed and your image stabilization in your lens, and you'll be golden. Another difference in the two cameras is in the EVF, the viewfinders. And one thing I didn't even notice by using both these cameras at the same time, I didn't notice until I started doing the write-up on this and looking at things, was the eye cup is different on these two cameras. The R6 Mark II has a larger eye cup and an extra layer of rubber on it than the R8 has. By using the two cameras, I didn't realize that until I started looking at it later. I noticed the difference in the eye relief on the two cameras. But that's not the difference we're talking on these two cameras. What we're talking about is the resolution of the two EVFs. So the R6 Mark II has 3.6 million dot screen, and the R8 has 2.3 million dot screen. They both have 120 megahertz refresh, which means you're going to have a lot smoother view of everything that's going on. But I tell you right now, using the two cameras, I didn't see that huge difference between the two. I could see a little bit of difference, but the R8, everything you need to see and the clarity and everything is great with this camera. It is more than adequate to do what you need to do. You can see everything in there. You can see your subject, you can see your lighting, you can see your exposure, you can see all the numbers. and all the graphs that you need to see, like the histogram and stuff through it. So the EVF on the R8 is quite good. More resolution? Yes, be better, but I don't see that you really have to have it on this camera. It's quite well the way it sits. The last difference of these two cameras is the R8 does not allow raw output through the HDMI. Most wildlife photographers are not going to be concerned about that, and personally I'm not concerned about it, even though I shoot a lot of video with wildlife. But there may be a few of you that is a concern, but for me that's not a concern, and I don't really do too much HDMI out to the recorder unless I'm recording just the EVF, which I don't care about the resolution as much on that. So a quick rundown of these two cameras, those differences all again between the R6 Mark II and the R8, the things the R8 does not have. I wrote them down over here so I don't forget them. A lack of joystick, no IBIS, a lower resolution of the EVF, no full mechanical shutter, touch smaller buffer, one card versus two card in the card slots, smaller battery, less weather sealing, and a smaller body size. And with all that, is that a $1,000 difference right out of the box for wildlife for this camera versus this camera? Yeah, it's pretty close. The difference in that would be about $1,000. But I think I have an add-on you can put to this R8 that will make this more palatable difference between the two cameras to maybe warrant going to the R8 versus the R6 Mark II. And that's by adding a battery grip. Now, the R6 Mark II has a battery grip made by Canon, and I always suggest you buy original manufacturer parts and components for your camera versus third party, especially batteries for a camera. A little PSA here. I've seen so many cameras, friends of mine, get fried because using third-party batteries of Nikon, Sony, or Canon, and not using original ones, and they brick their cameras. So if I bought a battery grip, and if I own the R6 Mark II, I would own a battery grip because it is still fairly small in the hand. Both cameras in the hand are too small for me for what I want. The R7, I'd love to have a battery grip, but does not have a battery grip. And that's the same problem that the Canon RP has. The Canon RP, Canon makes an extender, but it's only about, not even a full inch, about a 3/4 of an inch, and it's still not enough to make this camera feel bigger in the hand. But there are third-party battery grips for the Canon RP, and luckily they fit, because this is the exact same body, they fit the Canon R8. So I picked up a Velo battery grip for the Canon R8, a third-party battery grip. And I have a full video prior to this one that you should have seen that talked about this battery grip, so you're probably already ahead of me. So by adding this battery grip, what you're going to do is you're going to double the life of the battery right off the bat. This on here. Let's add this second battery back in here. Maybe. Now by adding those batteries into here, 2 batteries, I've doubled the battery life of this camera, and I've also solved a small problem. This camera now in the hand feels really good. Covers my whole hand, fits where I want it to. I can go portrait if I need to. Great, it feels like a better camera already. Now what's even more interesting is, with the battery grip installed and the R6 Mark II, the weight of these two cameras now is still almost the same. The next thing about this is, again, I would buy, if they made a battery grip for the R8, I'd spend the $250, $350, because that is what the grip costs from Canon for the R6 Mark II. It costs $350. Yes, you can buy third-party battery grips for this at $100, but they have the same issues this one's going to have with, you're not going to have on this side, you're not going to have your shutter dials, your ISO dials, and your focus buttons. But by buying the Canon one, you're going to have those things. So I would always suggest buying that. So with that said, that is about a $300 difference between these two, because this battery grip runs right now about $50 or so on Amazon. So you get about a $300 difference. So now you're talking at almost $1,300 difference of these two cameras. Or if you added the third-party battery grips around $100, now you're at $1,050 or so difference. So that may help you get into this camera as opposed to the R6 Mark II if you're on the fence about saving money. You're basically going to save $1,300 on this one by adding this battery grip and having 2 batteries. And about the 2 batteries in here, when I went out shooting swans the other day, I was out in the snow and the cold. It was about 15 degrees out, and I was sitting out on the ice with this camera the whole time. And with the 2 batteries, it said I went through 50% of the battery on this one. And I pulled both batteries out. One was fairly green, the second one had just one dot blinking. So I used one battery in about 4 hours. Now I was turning the camera off in between action, but that was pretty good, I think, for battery life on this. So I think you get a full day out of these 2 batteries in this camera with a battery grip. So even with the battery grip as it sits right here, which camera should you buy if you're doing wildlife photography? Well, that's really up to you. You need to go rent both these cameras and look at them. For me, for what I needed for this third camera, remember this is my C camera, it's not even my B camera, but for sometimes it'd be B camera. This is exactly what I needed. This had everything I needed, but that $1,000 extra was a little hard to swallow, so I tossed it away. I didn't think about it again. But once the R8 came out, it had the exact same setup, exact same features. I wasn't worried about IBIS. I wasn't worried about the battery size. All those things that had different versus these 2 cameras were not a detriment to me, so that's why I picked up the Canon R8 over the R6 Mark II. Now, another bit of advice I would say between these 2 cameras, if those are the same to you, that IBIS is not a big issue to you. If adding the battery grip will get you to the battery life you're hoping that this camera had. But nothing you can change about the IBIS on that at all. But you can change the battery in the field by adding the grip onto it. Well, everyone, I hope this helped you understand more of the difference of these 2 cameras and some pros and cons of which camera you could use and the features, and some add-ons like this you can do to negate a couple of things that were some of the cons on this camera that may help you out. But that's just my ideas, my thoughts, my testing of these 2 cameras. For you to make a decision on which camera to get yourself, please go out and rent the cameras first. Play with both of them, see which one, if the extra features of this one are worth it or the less features of this one are not worth it. So go test it out yourself, see which one you find better. But those are my thoughts and my testing and my results from these 2 cameras. And if you guys are liking the channel and you enjoy the channel, please like, subscribe, share, all those things. Watch the video all the way through if you can. If you want to help the channel out monetarily, think about becoming a member of the channel. It's as low as $1 a month, and it helps me, buy things like this, get out in the field and do more reviews and more adventures. And until the next time, guys, you stay safe and go out and run that shutter.